All right, so assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we are going to continue what we were doing with Tafseer Surah Al-Ma'ida. And this is the part that we were doing yesterday. And of course, certainly, we were still talking about a sa'iba, and we kind of went in some details in regards to sa'iba and who are sa'iba. And of course, it was relating to a certain ritual that the disbelievers and the idolaters were believing in. It's a practice where they would orient or at least consider certain animals to be anointed or chosen for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore they had certain rituals to relate to those types of animals, and those types of animals were named in this ayah, whether we're speaking about the animals that were left in a certain way, not touched, and because of considering it sacred, and other animals that had a number of different born girls or different born boys, etc. So they had certain rituals for those. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَكِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبِ. And in the end, such rituals, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is exposing them and exposing the whole idea of their rituals, that it was not based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they were not given the permission or at least the legislation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly the whole concept of legalizing something or forbidding something is supposed to be based on the benefit. So to avoid and to somehow obstruct the benefit, thinking that it is somehow smart or giving it a different narrative as this is inspirational, this is a way to get closer to God, etc., is basically a form of iftira al-kadhib ala Allah. It's a form of creating blasphemy and creating lies upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with no revelation given to them. وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. And most of them, لَا يَعْقِلُونَ, they are not capable of comprehending, to understand legislation, that it's supposed to be based on giving benefit and not obstructing benefit. So لا يعقلون, that's basically the paradigm to tell us that when we're speaking about legislation, it's supposed to, one, start with al-wahi, two, continue with, of course, the whole concept of al-wahi is teaching us that the whole idea of legislation is supposed to be based on continuing benefit and not obstructing benefit. Okay, so the other thing that al-Qurtubi wanted to, I guess, talk about in regards to this ayah, because remember, al-Qurtubi talks about Jami' al-Ahkam al-Quran, so he's basically collecting all the different rulings and legislatures that relate to a certain ayah. And since, of course, we're talking about a sa'iba, he wanted to use that point and actually talk about a sa'iba, or at least first al-ahbas, and talked about al-awqaf. We talked about al-awqaf as a system to designate certain property or certain wealth to be for the sake of donation. We talked about that. We said it is, majority of the scholars considered it as permitted because the Sahaba had done that. The Prophet ﷺ permitted that even for the Sahabi that wanted to designate a certain amount for Khaybar, and the Prophet ﷺ had instructed him to designate the net and not necessarily designate the profit of it. And in order to speak about whether it is permissible or not permissible, we would go back to the hadith. And certainly Abu Hanifa was the only one that regarded that that is not permissible, but later his students Abu Yusuf and Zufar, after knowing the different evidences and knowing of the different practices that the Sahaba themselves had practiced, they had basically left the opinion of their Shaykh Abu Hanifa and considered a new fatwa for the Madhab Hanafi. So we went in details with that, and we also went in details We also went in details with something called the sa'iba, which actually, we also went in details with this one. On the ruling on using the different awqaf. In other words, if you were to designate a certain wealth for awqaf, are you able to use it or not? And we said you cannot use it, but if you later needed to use it, you would be using some of it and not all of it. And same thing with your children. So if we consider a certain amount or a certain property to be designated for awqaf, we can never retrieve it. We can never use it entirely. And we can, though, use part of it in situations where the person had gotten poor, or the person's children probably got poor, but not whatsoever retrieve it entirely. And at the same time, it would be given in or made in a contract or type of a contract where it is limited usage and not necessarily unlimited, just so that we would maintain the idea and the concept of waqf. So we talked about that. We also لا يجوز الوقف أن ينتفع بوقفه. We talked about this one. Oh, عتق السائبة. We also talked about freeing السائبة, freeing the slaves, but we talked about a system which is الموالي compared to السائبة. We said that the system of course, in Islam, is that no one would be left without having a family that's supporting them, a family that's there to give them the necessary, let's call it supervision, let's call it maintenance, let's call it support, etc. All of that is supposed to be the family, and certainly that is to remove the burden off the government, and therefore the family would be a closer relationship to the person, and therefore il-mawali, even if that slave was to be freed, they would take the name and therefore be under that family's responsibility even if they were freed. That's why they would be called il-mawla, so they would take the name. We also talked about something called a sa'iba, where the freed slave would actually be freed but would not be given the name of the family that freed him. And we went in details whether that was haram, whether that was haram to also mean unethical, or whether that was makruh, or whether that was permissible, but they all agreed, or at least not all, but majority agreed that it would still be considered nafidh. What is nafidh? Nafidh meaning that it would still take place, that this slave would still be considered free, and it would be legal to free them, but is it necessarily nafidh in terms of, at least is it necessarily of their choice to say, well, I don't want to give you the name, or how about you don't take our name, etc. But in the end is that the scholars debated on this piece of it. So the debate was more on the piece of, can we, if we free a slave, can we necessarily take out the name? Can we necessarily say we don't want to give the name? Can we necessarily gift the name and say, I'll gift you with somebody else's name, or I'll give you, I'll basically give the honor to the other family to basically take your name, or take you as their slave, as if you were they were the ones to free you, etc. So we went in details with that. And part of the evidences was basically we came across this person, which is Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi. So we talked about Abu Ali al-Riyahi, and I made a mistake yesterday. Ironically, no one caught it. The mistake was when we talked about the wird. What is the wird? The wird is basically the reading, the recitation that Abu Ali al-Riyahi was doing. And is that him? Is that Abu Ali al-Riyahi? Yes, that Abu Ali al-Riyahi was doing, and no one actually caught it. So here we go. This quote right here. He said, "Kunna abidan mamlukin." We were slaves and basically didn't have our freedom. Some of us were doing certain taxes or certain, responsibilities that they were supposed to be doing. Some of us had a lot of chores to basically do in service. So we would complete reciting the Quran every single night. But then that was so hard on them to do, and it was becoming, of course, so hectic. So they went and found the Prophet ﷺ's companions, and they taught them how to recite the Quran once every Friday, which actually means every week. So when you say kul jum'ah, we're talking about every week. And he said, فَصَلَّيْنَا وَنِمْنَا وَلَمْ يَشُقَّ عَلَيْنَا. So we prayed and we slept, and it was not hard upon us. So, and I miscalculated yesterday, ironically. I looked at the number 28, and I divided the 7, or divided the 30, which is 30 juzu, by 7, and I looked at 4. Or no, I was supposed to look at 4, but I actually looked at the 7 instead of 4, and no one picked it up. So it was supposed to be 30 juzu divided by 7 days a week. In other words, they were reading approximately 4 and a couple pages, 4 juzu and a couple pages per day. So if we were to calculate every juzu for a person that reads fast, every juzu is going to be 20 minutes. Okay, so every juz is going to be 20 minutes. So we're speaking about almost an hour and a half of reading Quran every day. That's the time that they had spent for their wird, almost an hour and a half. Okay, so just wanted to share that one. It's a mistake. I don't know how. And last night I was thinking of this because definitely I'm behind, and I started just doing muhasabat al-nafs. I'm saying I was supposed to read 7 ajza every day, and I wasn't doing that, and I started doing muhasabat al-nafs, and I said, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. How is that even possible, to be able to do that every single night and still be able to sleep and still be able to do the work? But then I did my calculation back again, and I realized that I made this silly mistake. All right, so let's go back to our tafsir right there. So we're right there. قلت أبو العالية الرياحي البصري التميمي. So Abu al-Aliya, we said he is one of the tabi'een, and we talked about his life. Let's summarize his life a little bit, should we? So Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi, he was a slave. His female master basically had freed Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi, and when she freed him, she started going around the masajid announcing that she had freed him. Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi, he took and learned the Quran directly from one Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abu Dhar, Abu Ubay ibn Ka'b. That one's really important. Ibn Mas'ud, and certainly Ibn Abbas, Sayyid ibn Thabit, and other Sahaba. That makes him a really important tabi'i right there. And he even memorized the Quran from who? Ubay ibn Ka'b. Who's Ubay ibn Ka'b? Ubay ibn Ka'b is one of Kuttab al-Wahi. He's one of the scribers of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is just a direct thing. And we talked about Abu al-Aliya al-Riyahi, that he had died, well, differences of opinions. Was it 90? Was it 93? Or was it 106 Hijriya? So we're just looking at that time period when a lot of the tabi'een had actually died around this date. So Ata ibn Abi Rabah died around this date. Who else? Sa'id ibn Jubair died around 96 Hijriya, 95 Hijriya. So we're looking at a number of different scholars actually dying around this date. Okay, let's continue with what we were doing. right there, and he talked about al-Qurtubi wanted to say, well, Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi himself was Sa'iba, and that's his evidence as a Maliki to prove, or another evidence to prove that the opinion that Abu Hanifa had made in regarding that is Sa'iba, and the whole idea of a Sa'iba is not permissible and unethical in Islam, wanted to say, well, here's one evidence that Abu al-Ali al-Riyahi himself was actually that. Ibn Nafi said, لا سائبة اليوم في الإسلام ومن أعتق سائبة كان ولاؤه له. وبه قال الشافعي وأبو حنيفة وابن الماجشون ومال إليه ابن العربي. I want you to look at this one. Who's Ibn Nafi? Ibn Nafi was tabi'i tabi'i, and he said there is no sa'iba fil Islam. There is no sa'iba in Islam, meaning that it's not permissible in Islam. But what about if somebody were to actually tell a slave, hey, you're afraid, and this person is not taking the name? They would say, well, وَمَنْ أَعْتَقَ سَائِبًا. In other words, it is going to be legal and legitimate to free the slave as sa'iba without giving them the name, but kana wala'uhu la'hu, meaning what? Meaning the name would still be considered as belonging to the person that freed him, and that is not legitimate to disregard, or at least let's say obstruct them from getting the name. And that's what Shafi'i said. Abu Hanifah ibn al-Majishun. Ibn al-Majishun is actually Maliki, and so is Ibn al-Arabi. Okay, so Ibn al-Majishun and Ibn al-Arabi, both Malikis, and you could see Shafi'is, and you could say, of course, Abu Hanifa's students. They both had said that no, the name is to be basically going back to the person that had freed the slave. And that's the evidence that they had used. إِنَّمَا الْوَلَاءُ لِمَنْ أَعْتَقَ. What does that mean? So basically, even though there's no slavery today, but I think it's important to learn this information, because oftentimes I would get people sending me misconceptions, questions about Islam, and thinking that Islam basically comes from the whole idea of slavery, or that Islam permits slavery, etc. So I want you to keep in mind that slavery, or at least the whole concept of irriq, is completely different than the whole act of slavery that was practiced in the West. This is extremely important to say, because many would use irriq and translate it as slavery, and it becomes very confusing for many Muslims and for many non-Muslims, thinking that it's actually the same. When you look at irriq, you could say that إِنَّمَا الْوَلَاءُ لِمَنْ أَعْتَقَ, that there's a type of taking the name, there's a type of giving honor, there's a type of family embracement, there's a type of support, even if this slave was freed, etc. So Islam's let's call it riq system is not equivalent to the slavery system. And even if we look at some certain translations, or probably look at some certain practices, it's a completely different system. And therefore, to help and to understand the whole idea of slavery in Islam, the whole idea of slavery in Islam is completely different. It's a riq system. So to say that it's slavery in Islam is also not accurate, but I don't have any other equivalent word to use for irriq but slavery. Okay, but slavery comes with a whole idea, in a whole package of practices, in a whole package of discrimination, a whole package of pains that definitely were there, a lot of pain, not pains, but a lot of pain that was definitely connected to slavery, and definitely comes with a long history of slavery in the way that it was practiced in the West. And therefore, when I don't have an equivalent word to the riq system, and I use slavery, use the word slavery, sometimes it can be confusing, can be misleading, can definitely be bringing a lot of misconceptions that basically comes with the word. So I would like to just note this one. When we speak about slaves, when we talk about al-wala, when we talk about al-itq, when we talk about freeing slaves, when we talk about the whole idea of mamalik, it's completely different in the practice in Islam. Within the Islamic system is completely different. The rights that they are given is completely different. What brings in slavery is completely different than in the West. In Western slavery, kidnapping from the African countries, kidnapping from other countries was something that they basically practiced in order to bring slaves as basically a method to bring in not only the slaves, but it was considered bringing in working hands and laborers. So it was considered that that's a method that was considered as enriching the economy. Okay, but in Islam, reducing and limiting it to only military and political way, and so it was a method that was used against the Muslims, so the Muslims maintained this one, but still opened the doors to freeing the slaves slash riq, whether they were Muslim or not Muslim, as being something that is honorable, as being a good deed, as being something that is of the highest levels of making a good deed, and definitely Islam would encourage that. Okay, so let's look at إنما الولاء لمن أعتق. What is الولاء? الولاء is basically, remember the system that we talked about? It's giving basically the name, it's giving the respect. That respect would be for لمن أعتق, for the person, whoever is basically the person to free that slave, then the name would go basically to the slave based on the person that freed the slave. Okay, let's continue right there. I wanted to look at this one. I know I didn't highlight it. لا سائبة في الإسلام. There's no سائبة في الإسلام. Want to look at this one. And he said, ولم نقف على الحديث عند غير ابن عبد البر. He said, we couldn't actually find the hadith except Ibn Abd al-Barr mentioning this hadith. And Ibn Abd al-Barr was actually a 7th century Hijrah scholar. So to not have this hadith anywhere is really letting us know and giving us an indication that this hadith might not actually have any asl, might not have any narration, might not have any source whatsoever. So then that actually requires lots of details, and at least lots of detailed research. All right, let's see. Let's move on right there. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا. I can see someone put something. Oh, you want me to slow down in speaking? Okay. All right, Noura. I'll slow down in speaking, inshallah. And sometimes when I guess I want to complete an ayah or we're reviewing something, just don't want to repeat too much. So I think, and my mind would tell me, why don't you say that faster, because you already said it before. So that's what happens to me. So I start speaking faster because I don't want to bored the attendees. Okay, so we finished with this ayah right there and all the different things that al-Qurtubi thought was relevant that he had to say in regards to that ayah. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا إِلَى مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَإِلَى الرَّسُولِ قَالُوا حَسْبُنَا مَا وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا عَلَيْكُمْ أَنفُسَكُمْ لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. Okay, let's stop right here. So we've got two of these ayat. Let me translate just a surface translation. And وَإِذَا قِيلَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا إِلَى مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَإِلَى الرَّسُولِ قَالَوْا حَسْبُنَا مَا وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. If they were told to come to what was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ما أنزل الله وإلى الرسول. And to the Prophet, they would say, well, what our parents had left behind, in other words, our parents' experiences, our fathers' experiences, the legacy of what our ancestors had left behind is enough for us. In other words, we don't need any further resources. أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. Parenthetical clause. Did their fathers actually not know anything and not even have the guidance? So what was that supposed to be saying? It was basically right there scrutinizing their epistemology. Epistemology was scrutinizing their sources and their resources for knowledge and telling them, well, the experiences that you got from your parents and your ancestors is basically based on people that didn't really have enough data. That's لا يعلمون شيئا. They don't have enough data. Even their experience, the anecdotal experience, lacked data. It basically lacked the information to know even where this was taking them. In other words, it lacked the information to know the consequence of such behavior and where this was leading them. And therefore, it cannot be used as a considerable resource to know the truth and to consider that that's their evidence to know and show and prove that this practice of the wasila, the ham, the sa'iba, etc., or even other religious practices were somehow considered as acceptable, as containing an inspiration. So they wanted to say their place of inspiration, their place of knowledge was actually coming from the legacy that their parents had left behind. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, لا يعلمون and لا يهتدون. So they have no information, no data to know whether the basis of it or whether this was leading towards a good cause and a good consequence or not. ولا يهتدون. And they will not basically give them the guidance. So لا يعلمون, whether we're speaking about data of the past, or لا يهتدون, whether we're speaking about finding future good consequence. In other words, a good result. So whenever, and that tells us that if we are speaking about any type of any behavior, in order for us to consider it as ethical, it needs to contain one, data, at least, well, it needs to contain three things. Number one, it needs to contain foundation from ما أنزل الله. It needs to contain, you need al-wahi. Here we go. That's the first thing. You need ما أنزل الله. You need al-wahi to let you know whether this is an information or whether this is backed up by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, that's the true inspiration. Two, you need the data to basically learn, and well, you need the wahi, and the wahi, there's a wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's a wahi that was sent onto the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, right? There's a wahi sent onto the Prophet ﷺ himself, which basically is a sunnah. So ma anzal Allah is basically the Quran. Ila Rasul is basically to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so those are the two sets of wahi. And then they basically said, well, we only go back to their parents. That was to basically denounce Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ. So they wanted to give an alternative. Their alternative was their parents. Then the second, the second obstruction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, لا يعلمون شيئا. Well, their parents, لا يعلمون شيئا, they had no information, which tells us that in order to consider something as legitimate, to consider something as ethical, you definitely need al-wahi as your first source, but you also need to continue with having certain data. So that's why when we speak about al-ijtihad, we say that al-ijtihad is also al-hukmu ala al-shay' far'un an tasawwurihi. Let's write that down, right? Let's do that. Al-hukmu ala al-shay' Here we go. Let's write that down. الحكم على الشيء فرع عن تصوره. In order for us to rule on something, that's basically going to also be reflected and reflecting based on how you understand the situation. So if we need, for example, a ruling in regards to, let's say, a medical issue, we definitely need medical experts on board to help us understand and make sure that what we're seeing in the text, that is al-Wahy, is coming in to basically with the data to help us understand things right, because al-Ijtihad is all about bringing in the most benefit. Okay, the most benefit, because Sharia itself is a maslahatun kulluha. Sharia is all about bringing in good interest, is all about bringing in the benefit. That's basically what Sharia is all about. And finally, وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. So, وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ, they were not guided. And that's also an indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, so certainly you need al-Wahy you need the data in relationship to whatever you are basically studying or whatever you are basically looking at. And you also need to make sure that this is going to, here we go, bring in hidayah. What is al-hidayah? Al-hidayah is, one, it can be a literal word, meaning hidayah, to bring you the guidance, to bring you the most benefit in this life. It could also mean a more, let's call it technical term, to mean al-hidayah, to bring you guidance in al-akhirah. In al-akhirah, in the hereafter. Okay, so when you look at al-hidayah, this is also an indication that in order for us to research any type of, whether we're speaking about akhlaq, decision making, you definitely need to go back to see what the resources in terms of text is telling you, to research the data, as long as this data is permissible, or at least basically going in parallel with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, then in that situation, you're going to look at, finally, is what guidance is this taking me to? What is the consequence? What is the result? All these three areas are basically key in every decision making. Three things. Number one, look at the text. Number two, research the data. Number three, basically looking at the result. Where is this taking me? Now, let's just assume that the data that we have is basically coming in to disprove what al-Wahy was telling us. Is that possible? That's possible. But that would be within the research that they had brought forth. But if the data that they had reached, or they had gotten to find, is basically, let's say, contradicting what is in al-Wahy, we would not doubt al-Wahy, we would doubt the data. If your data is contradicting al-Wahy, you got a problem with your data. Your data is missing the right data. The information in your data is basically missing, or the interpretation for that data is wrong. Keep this one, on mind, okay? What does that mean? Let's look at a lot of, especially in the fields of psychology, they would do a lot of studies, okay? Now, the studies they would do, they would have statistics, they would have neurology or neuroscience, basically doing certain research, etc. And the area that becomes a tricky place where many of the students, especially in psychology and especially the undergrad, where they do not pick up on, is the interpretation for that data. How do you interpret that data? If the interpretation is contradictory to what was revealed in the Quran and the Sunnah, then the interpretation is either going to be coming from الظن يتبعون إلا الظن or الهوى, and therefore, if it's contradicting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, it's going to be coming from either a wrong speculation, a wrong interpretation, or it's going to be coming from some kind of lobbying that was and that was driven by al-hawa, by desire. All right? Just keep this one in mind. In other words, scrutinizing the ideas and scrutinizing the interpretation is key to understanding how we read the information and how we read the data and how we get to making sure that we're understanding, one, al-wahi, two, the data, and three, in order to take us to the right results. What results are we talking about? We're talking about the results, whether al-hidayah, to mean dunya results. Is this maximizing the benefit for us? Is this maximizing the happiness, the quality of life, etc.? Well, that's one hidayah that we certainly want. So yes, Islam does not tell you to not maximize al-hidayah, to not maximize wealth, to not maximize richness, to not maximize health, to not maximize. Certainly, Islam wants you to basically increase, whether we're speaking about wealth or whether we're speaking about health or quality of life. Islam wants you to increase, basically get a good result. Islam doesn't want you to become poor, doesn't want a bad economy, doesn't want more crime, doesn't want more stress, doesn't want. No, Islam wants you to maximize the good. Okay, so that's part of al-hidayah, maximizing the good in al-dunya and maximizing the good in al-akhirah as well. So looking at these areas, just in learning about them, helps us understand how we research our decision making. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was scrutinizing الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا, and the thoughts that they were basically exposing about themselves and thinking that, well, we've got our resources. And they said, well, your resources actually contain lots of faults, lots of gaps. Your resources, whether you want to say that anecdotal is not enough, you definitely need more than experience and personal experience to prove something as good and to prove something as leading to a good result and proving something that it's basically maximizing the good. Okay, so let's see. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu alaykum anfusakum, telling the believers, focus on yourselves, and of course, bring in that. Okay, go ahead, Noura. Gives me some time to drink water.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, a lot of times, subhanallah, like they would try to, the translators of the Quran, they would try to, especially the ayat regarding like science and stuff, right. and then subhanallah, we would get like the tools later, and we would see it's totally different, right? The technology.
Well, absolutely, Noura. I like that you pointed that one out. When we're speaking about ayat that relate to science, or that relate to, I guess, different fields in science, whether we're speaking about astronomy, whether we're speaking about geology, etc. The words in the ayat that were used, okay, the words that were used, there's the literal meaning and there's the surface meaning, and you want to remember even the mufassirin, the scholars of tafsir, they didn't have the tools that we have today. So you will find certain mufassirin in interpreting the ayat, or at least interpreting certain words in the Quran based on their knowledge at the time. And that's why sometimes it would really come out as as many people and would say, well, this is what Islam says. I would say, what do you mean what Islam says? How do you identify what Islam says? You would go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. That's exclusive what Islam says. But here's the thing. Even if you were to go back to the Quran and Sunnah, because the words themselves sometimes were in broad terms, sometimes they were specific, sometimes containing some ambiguity, sometimes giving, of course, you want to keep in mind that the Quran is not a book of science, but the Quran is a book of guidance. The Quran, yes, certainly was giving you certain words to basically research, to let you know that this is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there are certain words that are very intricate to study and to really understand how, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the السماء انشقت. So when it said انشقت, so when you look at the word انشقت, the word انشق actually means to rip. How is it that it would get ripped? It's not a fabric. It's not a fabric, but then you would realize that it's basically giving us an indication that it's not a solid thing. So when you look at certain words, they could sound metaphorical, but many times it would give you somewhat of a simile in order for us to understand how things are created, in what type of a physics, or biology, or even a structure this is created in. So that's to basically indicate certain signs of knowing certain details, and you would definitely need to compare it with what was known at the time, whether with what was known based on the Greek or the people in India or whatever country, or the Chinese or the Arab themselves. What did they understand in terms of their level of understanding science, geology, or astronomy, or whatever it is? And then you want to compare the words that are intricate in the Quran and see, well, what does that really reflect? What does that really mean? But here's the catch. Sometimes the mufassirin, they can do, especially Razi, they can do certain tafsir based on their knowledge about certain things at the time. And you would see some people thinking that whatever is in the book of tafsir is what Islam says, which is not accurate, because not everything in the books of tafsir could we necessarily use that as that's what Islam says. Okay. Same thing when you're looking at the books of fiqh, for example. We can't use that and say, well, that's what Islam says. But we will say, we've got an ayah, we've got a hadith, or we've got how the scholars interpreted this word or that word. This is important to keep in mind, because there's a difference with, well, what does the ayah say? Then we would say, well, how do the scholars interpret this word? Or how does the hadith first interpret that word? So that's basically another data. And then finally, we're going to see, when we're speaking about fiqh, especially fiqh, because that kind of becomes a tricky area, because we're trying to maximize the good here. Okay. If we're trying to maximize the good, sometimes we can have our interpretation if something doesn't contradict the Quran and Sunnah. So we're here looking at the data. Okay, we've got the data in place. The data is not contradicting Quran and Sunnah, but then we might actually have differences of opinions on how we maximize the good, or sometimes not only maximize the good, sometimes we can have differences of opinions in not only what result that brings, but sometimes we could see scholars had differences of opinions and how this does go in parallel with the legal maxims in Islam. In other words, when we say legal maxims, we're talking about whether something is ethical or not. Okay? Remember the legal maxims. We're talking about the preservation of deen, preservation of nafs, preservation of life, preservation of mental health, preservation of chastity and family, preservation of wealth. So you could have differences of opinions, just like about the sa'iba one. Remember the sa'iba? Is it ethical? Is it not ethical? Well, what if we had certain practices? How do we understand it in the lens of Quran and Sunnah that was encouraging freeing slaves, but at the same time, we may debate, and you could see the debate whether that was going in with the practices with what the people of Quraysh were doing. They basically designated certain animals or certain acts of good, which is not eating the animals or not harming them, or somehow considering that those animals are to be left and not touched, and therefore they considered that that was an act of being good. Certainly, if you were to look at it from the outside, you would say, well, yeah, I mean, right there, we're just letting the animal be a sacred animal. Where just like the Hindus, they're basically giving, all the respect for the cow. The cow basically is not to be slaughtered. If the cow wants to eat something from anywhere, we basically give it all the respect, and it basically eats from what it wants. And you know what? They'll even to shower with its urine, thinking that it has health benefits. They'll drink it, and even the cow dung. It's basically, hey, it's used for treatment. It's used for that. Let's just take that as an example, and you could say, well, hey, we're just respecting the cow. If we don't respect the cow, then we're not giving that respect that it deserves, that the respect to this animal. It's basically, hey, respecting animals. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell us, well, no. This had basically gone out of the limit. This has gone out of the limit that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had permitted, and therefore this would be considered as obstructing good. Then what defines good is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What defines good is basically the legal maxims that are coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to let us understand what makes good is really what defines good, and what makes good is really coming by the inspiration of Quran and Sunnah, and not necessarily a narrative created by whether it's the fathers or whether it's the society or whether it's the media. It's not coming from their narrative, because that's going to lack data. But let's just assume they had some data, whether the data that they had done in research, or whether the data that they had done in experiment, then in that situation, if it contradicts Quran and Sunnah, then we're going to say that data is containing faults. There's no way. It cannot whatsoever be equivalent to truth and reflecting truth, because if it contradicts the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that means there's something. Doubt your data and don't doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because that's the ultimate truth. Okay? And وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. The interpretation, basically, and how you interpret the data is also supposed to be leading to maximizing the good. Maximizing the good, whether in dunya or maximizing the good in akhirah, in your deeds. Any questions up to here? Okay. My phone is not next to me, so if you're sending me something, I can't see it. Okay, there are 4 different matters that al-Qurtubi wanted to discuss in regards to this ayah. So number 1, he said, the scholars had said that the relationship between this ayah and the ayah before it is basically warning us from taking our ancestors, or basically taking whatever practices that were handed on to us as basically sacred. In other words, telling us that you have to scrutinize that. But here's one thing. The problem comes with understanding إذا قيل لهم تعالوا إلى ما أنزل الله وإلى الرسول قالوا حسبنا وجدنا عليه آباءنا. So that one's really straightforward. That ayah is really straightforward because this ayah right here is really straightforward, that this ayah is saying, well, they لا يعقلون, and they were creating blasphemy, but the alternate resource that they should turn to is this. And then يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم. O you who believe, this one's rather tricky. I'm going to read it and interpret it the wrong interpretation, which is the surface interpretation. The surface interpretation is definitely going to be wrong, but there's no other interpretation. If I were to interpret it word by word, it's definitely going to be misunderstood. So I'm going to give it the surface interpretation, and definitely you're going to say, well, this is what the ayah is saying. Let's see what the ayah is saying. يا أيها الذين آمنوا. O you who believe. Simple. Basically directing the words, if you want to be part of the believers, here's a call to you. عليكم أنفسكم. عليكم أنفسكم. Matter and care about yourselves. لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم. It should not harm you, whoever goes astray, if you were to find guidance. In other words, it's kind of like saying, don't worry about the others and just care about yourself. If they do what's wrong, well, don't worry about it. It shouldn't harm you. إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا. To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the return that you will all be going for. And فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ. فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ, the letter fa is to bring about an indication that this is an immediate chronology. This is this letter fa. It's different than thumma. Thumma means that there's a time lapse. Fa means it's an immediate thing. Wa means that there's no indication of time lapse. It's just an addition. فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. And then he will inform you of what you had done. تَعْمَلُون is different than تَعْلَمُون. تَعْلَمُون is what you had known. تَعْمَلُون, what you had done. Okay? So what is the problem with this interpretation? It's basically telling me that I shouldn't worry about other people's misguidance. I should just care about myself. So in other words, don't do amr ma'ruf wa nahy munkar. I don't understand this. Really? Is this what that ayah is saying? So that's what we're going to explain. Okay, so that was also a misinterpretation that was done by many, and we're going to say alaykum anfusakum. We're going to break it down and really understand what this ayah truly means and not the wrong interpretation. Alaykum anfusakum, it actually means احفظوا أنفسكم من المعاصي. Number one, when you say alaykum anfusakum, alaykum, when I say alaykum, it's basically saying you have to preserve yourself. You've got a responsibility to preserve what? Preserve your deen. Alaykum anfusakum. I've got 5 legal maxims. Let's write them down, right? And we usually do it like this. So my responsibility towards myself is in what? Number 1, preserve your deen. Preserve your deen, meaning preserve your religion. That's your responsibility. That's number 1. Number 2, preserve your nafs. Preserve your health. If you need treatment, well, you got to seek it. Number 3, preserve your DNA, your aql. Your aql, preserve your mental health. So what does that mean? If somebody is distressing me, I should just leave them? We'll talk about that in detail later, inshallah. No, it doesn't mean like that. Sometimes mental health, sometimes we basically need to research that mental health issue, and I've got some videos that you could actually watch on in that regards. Okay, and DNA and ird, and that's basically chastity and family. And number 5 is basically M stands for mal, which basically is referring to property and wealth. Okay, so here we go. That's basically عليكم أنفسكم. So you've got a priority, you've got a responsibility to take care of yourself. That's the first thing. Take care of yourself in regards to your deen. Make sure your deen is in place. Make sure your health is also in place. Make sure that your mental health is also in place. Your chastity in your family, that's a responsibility that you also have to make sure that it's in place. And the preservation of your property and wealth. That's the first thing. Before you go anywhere else, before you deal with people, you first have to make sure that your responsibility towards yourself, your family, is first taken in consideration. Okay, let's continue. Just give me a second. All right. So here he said, احفظوا أنفسكم من المعاصي. Preserve yourselves from sin. But of course, the word عليكم أنفسكم is more comprehensive than just sins. But of course, where did he actually bring that from? Well, he got that from the context for the ayah. So that's why he said عليكم أنفسكم. Where did you get it from the sins? Why did he say from sins? He said, because it was talking about hidayah. So it wasn't necessarily comprehensive to tell you take care of your health and go exercise and do that. He was saying, well, yes, it's basically relating more of preserving your guidance, preserving your deen, preserving yourself from keeping yourself from engaging in any major sins or minor sins. So that's basically what al-Qurtubi wanted to say. He said, I basically got an evidence to prove that it is more specific than a comprehensive interpretation to mean alaykum anfusakum, and to mean that you're supposed to preserve your mental health, your deen, your wealth, etc. So we're saying no, it's basically more specific. So we will say in general, alaykum anfusakum. It doesn't contradict when you're speaking about bringing guidance, because it's more comprehensive, and preserving your health, preserving your mental health, or preserving all of that is a form of hidayah anyways. So in the end, there's no contradiction. Okay, because when you say alaykum anfusakum, al-ibra bi'umum al-lafz. Well, let's write that down, right? Al-ibra بعموم اللفظ. Let's write that down. العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. What does that mean? The theme is actually coming from عموم اللفظ, from the comprehensiveness, the generalization within a statement, and not necessarily in the particularization of the reason for it, or at least the context of it as well. So we would look at that and we would take that in consideration. Okay, so let's continue right there. Oh, hold on. Let's continue right there. Let's look at point number 3. روى أبو داود والترمذي وغيرهما عن قيس. This is important. We're going to get there. قال خطبنا أبو بكر الصديق فقال إنكم تقرؤون هذه الآية وتتأولونها على غير تأويلها يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم وإني سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إن الناس إذا رأوا الظالم فلم يأخذوا على يديه أوشك أن يعمهم الله بعذاب من عنده. Straightforward. Let's see. Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi. Let's look over there. And here we go. This is the narration. He said, and even Musnad Ahmad mentioned it, and even Ibn Majah mentioned it, and those are the hadith numbers. Okay, what did he say? And others, basically. He said, قال خطبنا أبو بكر الصديق. Who's that? Well, that's Qais. So Qais was one of the key narrators that narrated the almost 157 hadith that are narrated by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq only. So we don't have a hadith that were as many as Abu Hurairah But what I want to keep in mind, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq died 2.5 years after the Prophet ﷺ had died. He was only a Khalifa for almost 2.5 years. Okay, so let's see. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq made a khutbah. What's khutbah? It's like a ceremony or an oration. And he said, you read this ayah and you interpret it in a way that was not intended within the ayah, which is the ayah that we're doing. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا عَلَيْكُمْ أَنفُسَكُمْ. And he said, and I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, if the people were to see an oppressor, and فَلَمْ يَأْخُذُوا عَلَى يَدَيْهِ is an idiom. فَلَمْ يَأْخُذُوا عَلَى يَدَيْهِ, it doesn't literally mean to take the person's hand and say, hey, do this. This is an idiom to mean to stop it, to disempower. Disempower. So for the ilyad here is a metaphor to mean power. So يَأْخُذُ عَلَى يَدَيْهِ is to disempower, is to stop basically this ظالم, this oppressor. If they don't disempower, they don't stop basically this oppressor from the oppression that they're doing. If they don't stop them, أوشك أن يعمهم الله بعذاب من عنده. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, where the word أوشك means it will about to happen. It is about to happen. It will happen. In other words, this is a warning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may embrace them. Well, embrace is more of a merciful embracement, but this is more of a, I guess, encompass them. Maybe I should go back to the etymology to find the right specific word. So it-ta'meem is to cover something with something, but here it-ta'meem, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cover them, in other words, circulate them with a torment from himself, which is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish them if they were to see an oppressor and not disempower or stop the oppressor, or at least guide the oppressor to somehow stop the oppression. And that's basically a very important hadith for those that want to say that we're supposed to be letting Bashar al-Assad continue with what he's doing, or we're supposed to be letting Sisi or letting these leaders, and we're not supposed to somehow tell them that what they're doing is wrong, because we're supposed to وَإِنْ أَخَذَ مَالَكَ وَضَرَبَ ظَهْرَكَ وَسَلْبَ مَالَكَ وَضَرَبَ ظَهْرَكَ, and thinking that, hey, we're supposed to just support our leaders no matter what they do. This hadith is, that hadith is actually weak, and this hadith is basically letting us learn that no, you cannot let oppression continue, thinking that if I were to stop it, that somehow I'm creating a disunity within the society. Let's see, Abu Isa said, هذا حديث حسن صحيح. Who's Abu Isa? Abu Isa is a Tirmidhi himself. He said, hadith hasanun sahih. It is a hadith that, what is hasanun sahih? Hasan would basically give an indication that the wording may not necessarily be as, let's call it, as the most authentic wording of it. We're speaking about the exact wording compared to other narrations, but Sahih means that it is an authentic hadith. Let's see. But here's one scholar that said, well, there's a problem with this hadith. And what is it? He said, well, I heard Waqi', who's actually a scholar that was actually one of Tabi'in. I can't remember if he's Tabi'in or Tabi'i. I would say he's Tabi'in because he was one of the shuyukh. Well, he wasn't one of the shuyukh of Shafi'i, but he is one major sheikh. Well, we'll look into Waqi' later. Anyhow, سمعت وكيعا يقول لا يصح عن أبي بكر عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ولا حديث واحد. So I heard him say that we don't have any authentic narration, not even for one hadith based on Abu Bakr. And then he basically inquired and said, not even the narration of Ismail an Qais. There is an Ismail an Qais right there. Not even that narration. And he said, Inna Ismail rawa an Qais mawqufan. He said, well, the narration that he had narrated was not necessarily coming all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, but it was more that it was a narration that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq himself was basically saying things and not necessarily making it tracing back to the Prophet ﷺ, because the opposite of al-mawquf is marfu'. Marfu' would mean it traces back to the Prophet ﷺ. The quote traces back to the Prophet ﷺ. Al-mawquf would be tracing back to the Sahabi, to the companion. Okay, and here in Naqash, even though not many scholars actually liked Naqash, we'll talk about him later. He said, هذا إفراط من وكيع. He said, that's actually this statement that there's not a single hadith that is not authentic of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He said that's an exaggeration and not necessarily quite accurate. Okay, so just wanted to say, and he said, and you had many narrations of Ismail that were narrated marfu'an. Remember, marfu'an meaning it traces back to the Prophet ﷺ, and certainly you've got, of course, فَمِنْهُمْ أَنْ أَسْنَدَهُ إِلَى النَّبِي وَمِنْهُمْ أَوْقَفَهُ عَلَى بَكْرٍ, and he wanted to say that, well, for this narration, some scholars actually said that this goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, and some scholars actually said this goes back to and traces back to the to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. So now you have a hadith that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq right there had basically mentioned teaching all the Muslims, and did he necessarily take the quote in الناس إذا رأوا الظالم فليأخذوا على يديه أوشك أن يعمهم الله بعذاب? Is this necessarily tracing back as a quote of the Prophet ﷺ, or is this Abu Bakr as-Siddiq learning the interpretation from and through the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore the quote is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, therefore making it mawquf and not necessarily tracing it back to the Prophet ﷺ, making it marfu'. Okay, so just wanted to note that one. And there's let's see, should we stop at this hadith at least? Well, we have to continue this little piece. Okay. روى أبو داود والترمذي وغيرهما عن أبي أمية الشعباني قال أتيت أبا ثعلبة الخشني فقلت له كيف تصنع بهذه الآية؟ فقال أية آية؟ قلت قوله تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم. قال أما والله لقد سألت عنها خبيرا. سألت عنها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال ائتمروا بالمعروف وتناهوا عن المنكر حتى إذا رأيت شحا مطاعا وهوى متبعا ودنيا مؤثرة وإعجاب كل ذي رأي برأيه فعليك بخاصة نفسك ودع عنك أمر العامة فإن من ورائكم أياما الصبر فيهن مثل القبض على الجمر للعامل فيهن مثل أجر 50 رجلا يعملون مثل عملكم. وفي رواية قيل يا رسول الله أجر 50 منا أو منهم؟ قال بل أجر 50 منكم. قال أبو عيسى هذا حديث حسن غريب. What is the story? So Abi Umayyah al-Sha'bani, he basically said, I came to Abu Tha'labat al-Khushani. I came to Abu Tha'labat al-Khushani and I said, how do you understand? كيف تصنع doesn't mean like how do you produce? No, this isn't how do you produce. This is like how do you interpret, how do you understand this ayah? And he said, which ayah you're talking about? He said, well, the ayah, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا عَلَيْكُمْ أَنفُسَكُمْ لَا يَضُرُّكُمْ مَنْ ضَلَّ إِذَا اهْتَدَيْتُمْ. Or you who believe, care about yourselves and don't, it should not harm you if others would go astray if you were to be guided. And he said, well, you had asked someone that is quite knowledgeable about this ayah. Is he praising himself? He's not praising himself. He's just basically saying, well, I've got some information in regards to this ayah, as I had asked the Prophet ﷺ about this ayah, and the Prophet ﷺ had said, quote, order for what is good. I'tamiru bil ma'ruf. Order for what is good and forbid what is wrong until you would say shuhan muta'an. What is a shuh al-muta'? A shuh is basically selfishness. Al-muta' is basically obedient to something. So what does that mean? A personal interests are basically driving the people. So we're seeing that everyone is just caring about their own personal interest. They don't care about others. It's just self-centricity, individualism that's basically driving the masses. وَهَوًا مُتَّبَعًا. And هَوًا مُتَّبَعًا. الهوى is supposed to be personal desire. مُتَّبَعًا. Muttaba'an means to follow. What are they following? If you see people just following their own desires, and all the drives are basically their own self-interest, and dunya mu'thara, everybody is just wanting to just care about their own dunya, their own matters. It's just about their own dunya, nothing else. Their fathers, mothers, parents, husband, wife don't care about them. It doesn't matter. As long as I'm happy, who cares about the others? That's dunya mu'thara. وَإِعْجَابَ كُلِّ ذِي رَأْيٍ بِرَأْيِهِ. And everybody is so. Al-i'jab is to be so intimidated or so happy, so proud about their own selves and about their own opinion. They're just so, hey, this is my opinion, and you have to basically respect it. You have to be tolerant of it. Even if it's wrong, you just have to, hey, you have to use some kind of a political correctness in a politically correct statement. That way you would not harm my beautiful feelings. And you have to basically, what? Just understand that إعجاب كل ذي رأي برأيه is the society that we're living in. Even if I'm wrong, even if I'm wrong. So what am I supposed to do? Oh, you just have to not tell me anything because you might hurt my feelings. Even if I'm wrong? Yes, even if I'm wrong. Why? I'm here being sarcastic, as you could see. Okay. All right. So this hadith is basically exposing the society that we're living in today, where everybody is so proud of their own opinion and thinking that we have to be tolerant of other people's opinions, even when they're wrong. Then in that situation, if, of course, telling people that this is wrong, and you're seeing people's drives are based on their interest, based on their own desires, and you could see that they're considering their dunya more than anything, and each one is so happy about their own opinion, then in that situation, فَعَلَيْكَ بِخَاصَّةِ نَفْسِكَ. You had tried your best. You tried to do your da'wah, then care about yourself first. And then you're going to leave amr al-amma. Then public matter, if you had done your chores, doing the da'wah, it doesn't mean you stop, but it means you continue doing the da'wah, but it means that you don't have to necessarily let that be the stressor for you. دع عنك أمر الهم فإن من ورائكم أياما الصبر فيهن مثل القبض على الجبر. For there, من ورائكم, in لغة عربية, الوراء can mean front and back. So this is talking about in the future. There will be days that will be coming where being patient in those days, being patient on what? Being patient in, one, living the principle, two, taking da'wah as a responsibility, then even doing da'wah, you're going to be mocked for doing it. Even the prophets were mocked. That's a type of sabr. So here he's saying that the patience is going to be like the patience as if you were holding on a burning coal. And for the person that is basically doing what is right, they would get the reward of 50 men doing what you're doing. And let's say in another narration, O Prophet of Allah, would they get the reward of 50 from us or them? So 50 men from their time or 50 men from our time. He said, بل أجر 50 منكم. In fact, 50 of, the reward of 50 men from your time. And Abu Isa said, هذا حديث حسن غريب. This hadith is Hasan. Hasan to mean it's a type of an authentic hadith. We just mentioned it earlier. Gharib means, well, there are different interpretations to what gharib, and this is more of an exclusive term for Tirmidhi. Some scholars actually said gharib means that he only found this narration in an exclusive narration, basically a narration that he had found, and did not find other narrators mentioning this narration, whether we're speaking about the chain of narration or whether we're speaking about the actual quote. And other scholars had said that that Tirmidhi would use this terminology as gharib to mean that he couldn't find any other narration to basically support this strange theme that is in it. Strange theme. The word gharib technically means strange. So why is it strange? Is it strange because it doesn't necessarily match a lot of the different narrations? Or is it strange because he doesn't have other narrators mentioning a similar narration, basically? Okay, so which one really matches the definition that Tirmidhi himself wanted? That's a differences of opinion. Let's see, Ibn Abd al-Barr, who's a Maliki scholar, he said, بل منكم, he said, هذه اللفظة قد سكت عنها بعض الرواة فلم يذكرها. Said right here, the one that is underlined in blue right there, he said some scholars and some narrators did not actually mention this piece of it. So this piece of it that says that no, as a matter of fact, they would get the reward of 50 from you, that is from the Sahaba. He said some narrators were quiet about it and didn't actually mention this one. Okay. So what does that mean? Should we leave da'wah or should we continue doing da'wah? If people are actually...
I have a question.
Go ahead, Noura.
Since we're talking about it, so I mean, as far as women and men, because subhanAllah, in Islam we have different responsibilities. So I mean, how can we understand this from a female perspective, Yani?
Well, it's not an issue of female perspective or male perspective, because al-haq doesn't change based on who is saying it. Al-haq is haq, Noura. All right?
Right, but should we go on TV and just be interviewed or you know what I mean?
As long as the woman is in hijab, what difference does it make if she's in hijab? I mean, you're walking down the street with your hijab and with the proper way of dressing and you talking in a certain way. What difference does it make if you were to go on TV, on camera? It's the same thing. So in public, all these people are seeing you in public, that's fine. But once you go on TV, there's a restriction. Where's the evidence to restrict that? There's no evidence to restrict it if it's on TV.
Well, let's say if you're like the the sister's husband or something didn't want her to go. You know what I mean?
Obeying the husband, then obeying the husband would become a priority, because at the end of the day, the husband does have the right to restrict. If there is something that is am in Islam, the husband does have the right to say, well, I'd like to add this restriction. I feel more comfortable that way. Then in that situation, she would say, well, I'll respect the husband's choice. Right? Because at the end of the day,
and then you wouldn't be held accountable because of this restriction, right?
Absolutely, you won't be held accountable.
Okay.
At the end, yeah, absolutely. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had given me certain restrictions. And if the husband wanted to add another restriction for, let's say, certain good reasons, and it wasn't personal reasons to mean something that personal to mean for his own personal interests, but no, he thought that this was going to bring a better benefit. And then in that situation, he can add on to that restriction. Okay, let's continue with this hadith and then we'll end it right here. روى الترمذي عن أبي هريرة عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إنكم في زمان من ترك منكم عشر ما أمر به هلك ثم يأتي زمان من عمل منهم بعشر ما أمر به نجا. قال هذا حديث غريب. Wait, what is it saying? You're in a time, whoever من ترك منكم عشر ما أمر به هلك, whoever leaves 1/10 of what they were ordered to do, they would be punished. So they were ordered to do certain things, and they're living at a time where if they were to leave 1/10 of what they were ordered to do, they would be punished. But then there's going to come a time, whoever out of them does 1/10 of what they were ordered to do, they would be saved. قال هذا حديث غريب. And he said, that is a Tirmidhi, this is a hadith gharib. And we just talked about gharib and what the definition of gharib for Abu Isa or Tirmidhi was meaning. What does that mean? And how do we understand this? So the Prophet ﷺ was basically telling us that the people back then were taking their deen more seriously. And if they were ordered to, let's say, do a set of different obligations or avoid a set of different matters, if they were to do 1/10, even 1/10, they would basically feel halak. They would feel, or they would be held accountable. So does that mean that things are changing? Yeah, one thing that's changing is the approach that people are approaching the revelation. At the time, they took the deen so seriously. They took the deen so seriously because they're sabiqun al-awwalun. They took the deen so seriously that even if they were to leave 1/10, just a small thing, they would take it so seriously, they would basically feel that they're going to be held accountable. But then at the end of the times, if somebody, they would only do 1/10. So now they're flipping it. This one, let's say all the good deeds, let's look at it, maybe make it like into a scale, right? Here we go. Here's our scale. I hope I do this right. Okay. Here's our scale. So at the time, back then, they did all the requirements. They fulfilled all the requirements, but only left 1/10 of a spot they couldn't do. And halak. They just, is it that they feel that they are punished? Or is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is holding them accountable? It could mean both. Now, at the end of the times, things are going to look different. At the end of the times, no, they're going to be doing the opposite. You know what they'll be doing? At the end of the times, they'll actually doing be doing the opposite. They'll only do 1/10, and all the others things they won't even do. They're so proud of themselves that they donated $50 at the masjid the other day, but they don't pray, they don't fast, they don't do, but they're so proud of themselves. They donated $50 at the masjid the other day. So proud of themselves. Or the other day, they basically shared a smile. That was their deed for the day. Or the other day, they basically went to the masjid, read 5 pages of Quran, or read a juz'. That's 1/10. Because they used to read the whole Quran. They would just sit and not get out of the masjid till they read the whole thing, or probably read 7 ajza or 10 ajza. Look at the difference. All right. And he said, يأتي زمان من عمل منهم بعشر ما أمر به نجا. And they would be just, they're just, even if it's 1/10 that they would do, it was probably their deed that helped them get out of hellfire. Naja, they were saved. قال هذا حديث غريب. He said that this hadith is basically غريب. What is غريب? We mentioned it before, right? Let's look at 7 right there. ابن الجوزي في العلل المتناهية قال النسائي هذا حديث منكر رواه نعيم بن حماد وليس بثقة. Okay, so النسائي said this is a hadith munkar. This hadith, what is munkar? Munkar meaning that there's no other narration to support it. Okay, and he said رواه نعيم بن حماد, and there's a narrator, his name is Nu'aym ibn Hammad, and he's not ليس بثقة. We can't trust his narration. Let's see Abu Hatim, you can't beat him في العلل. What did he say? He said هذا عندي خطأ رواه جرير وموسى بن أعين عن ليث عن معروف عن الحسن عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مرسل. What does that mean? Abu Hatim, he said, well, that's basically, I guess he's commenting on this one. I can't really see what هذا refers to. I would have to go for al-Hilal for Abu Hatim to actually see what he's really referring to. But in the end, he said that this hadith is mursal. What is mursal? Mursal meaning that the chain of narration basically had missing links to the Prophet ﷺ. And basically, some of the people in the chain of narration were not actually mentioned. Then they would have differences of opinions on how do we relate to al-hadith al-mursal? How do we relate to al-hadith that is missing links in the chain of narration? How do we understand it? How do we take it? At the end, whether this hadith, well, for sure it's not necessarily highly authentic. Okay? It's a hadith gharib. For sure it contains some weakness, but we could just get some inspiration to see that at the time they were more considerate to applying everything in the deen and not procrastinating and saying, I'll do this later. Maybe now, and thinking that if they were to, I don't know, put a hijab that's half the head, or probably just pray maybe 3 prayers a day, or probably read the Quran during Ramadan alone, that's basically their good Muslim. But no, there's a definition of what really a good Muslim means, that you're trying to compete. If you're at the highest level, wanting to be at the highest level, you're trying to compete with those salihin and not trying to compete with the people that are around you. There's a difference. Because with the people around you, you'll probably be a saint. You'll come out as a saint. You'll probably come out as a saint. But you want to compete with the salihin, you'll realize that you're way behind. when you compare yourself with the salihin, what they were trying to do. This is it. Inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah.
I just feel so subhanallah, like you know, you just feel like you're not doing enough.
I know, Noura. No matter it's no matter how much we do, we would always feel that we're not doing enough. And you compare yourself with those salihin, you feel you've got a lot of shortcomings. And that's one way to help us strive to become better. Okay. But don't let that overcome you to the level that you would basically give up. Okay. If it's a feeling that's motivating you to become better, then that's a positive feeling. But if it's a feeling that's making you give up, then you're in the wrong corner. Okay? So this is important to keep in mind.
Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. So this is it. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika.